Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly update for March 26, 2020. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof.com. And again, the vast majority of people are still quarantining. We're all taking precautions in some manner in order to reduce the spread of COVID-19 or the coronavirus. At least I hope that's what you and everyone around you are doing. There are now over 500,000 cases globally of the virus. We have multiple whistleblower stories today that are related to this pandemic. But first, some housekeeping from Brian.
Hello, everybody. This is Brian, Sound and Steam publishing editor at Shadowproof. Just wanted to remind you to subscribe to our show on YouTube, to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And if you appreciate this show, if you appreciate the reporting that we do at Shadowproof, we are 100% reader funded. Please chip in at shadowproof.com/donate. Kevin, I just want to dive right in here. We're going to switch things up a little bit with our show this week and actually start out with the Assange part of the show. So can you tell us about what's going on with Assange being denied bail this week?
Yeah, so we had the bail hearing. His attorneys made an application to the court it was March 25th. And again, this is extraordinary because all along they've probably had grounds to push for Assange's bail, but his attorneys, despite having some human rights grounds, maybe even grounds under the Convention Against Torture, hadn't done so. But with this pandemic, they're saying Julian Assange has a chronic lung condition, and so he's vulnerable to the pandemic in particular. There have been reports that 100 or so people at the Belmarsh prison in London, where he is being held, stayed at home sick. We're told to distance or be quarantine to halt the spread. That at least maybe a few of the staff at the prison did test positive for the virus, but it's insisted that the prisoners who are at Belmarsh, that none of them have it so far, but we do not know the extent to testing that may have gone on at the facility. It's a similar issue, which is what we're seeing at correctional facilities throughout the world. And so it's remarkable because his bail was denied by the judge. And this came on the same day that we had a human rights official from the United Nations, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, who urged governments to protect the health and safety of people in detention, and even said that governments are facing huge demands on resources in this crisis. They're having to take difficult decisions, but I urge them to not forget those behind bars or those confined in places such as closed mental health facilities, nursing homes, and orphanages, because the consequences of neglecting them are potentially catastrophic. It is vital that governments address the situation of detained people in their crisis planning to protect detainees, staff, visitors, and of course, wider society. And so you have officials like her. There are people who are part of the Prison Governors Association that have warned what's going on. The Prisoners Advice Service, an independent legal charity in Britain, have even recommended that specifically people awaiting extradition be released. Again, Julian has not been convicted of any crime. He's in there. And also the offense he's accused of is a nonviolent one. So it's unusual to be held in confinement, society to society. I mean, you would only be in there if you were probably someone who was thought to be a violent person who was going to reoffend and commit some kind of an act that was violent. So he's there, and she refused the offer to put him under house arrest, tag him electronically so that they could track him. She insists that he could flee. And I think what's important to understand, what's so extraordinary and repulsive about the decision here, given what could happen if the virus spreads within the prison, is that she's also showing her contempt for the institution of political asylum. Because the UK authorities maintain, as does the US government, that going into the Ecuador embassy was basically fleeing justice, was not availing oneself of something that's available to dissidents and activists around the world. We have multiple cases throughout the last decade of people entering embassies and seeking asylum because they felt they were under persecution from governments. And that's a normal thing. It's not fleeing justice. I mean, I think the fact that there are people who call this fleeing justice shows the political nature of what Julian Assange is accused of doing. And so there's a lot going on here with this. I think, importantly, the coronavirus has thrown Assange's case in flux because we had this upcoming hearing that was going to be happening in May, and it's likely to be postponed now. I think for the first time, we're seeing his legal team raise questions about whether they're going to be able to keep that schedule, if it's going to be safe. Since we did the show last week, we've seen quite an intensification of the spread in the United Kingdom with the government. They're actually changing its position. And at first they had this ridiculous notion that they were going to practice herd immunity and let it spread among the population. And then everyone would get stronger and you'd have people who were now no longer vulnerable to the virus, and they'd be able to survive this pandemic in ways that other countries hadn't. It would be the opposite of having to shut down. And it turned out that that was a horrible idea, and they're not trying that anymore. And in fact, they've taken the same steps that we've seen almost every single country at this point take to try to stop the spread. So we'll continue to follow what's happening with Julian Assange's case. His is a unique one, given the fact that he is someone who's being politically prosecuted by the United States. But yet what he's going through, and even his lawyers and people who support him are aware of this, what he's going through in the prison is something that we're seeing prisoners around the world have to deal with currently.
Thank you, Kevin. Definitely unconscionable that they would do this to Assange, considering they couldn't even keep him from deteriorating before the pandemic started, to the degree that he couldn't even really participate in his defense. So definitely dismaying to see this, but I appreciate you covering it. I want to move on to our next story here, out of Jacksonville and the defying the work from home order. Can you tell us what's going on with this story?
Is there a little bit of context, especially for people internationally? We've seen that Florida has lagged, one of the states that has resisted the trend of actually having shelter-in-place orders where you basically can't leave. You're supposed to just quarantine unless you need to go out to pick up food or get groceries, or if there's something that you have to do that might, involve an emergency. And in Jacksonville, Florida, so what you're seeing are mayors and different levels of government below the state level that are issuing their own orders to regulate because the state has been a miserable failure when it comes to protecting people. And so here in the city of Jacksonville, Florida, which Jacksonville has about 900,000 people. So it's possible for that to spread and the population there pretty easily. And so apparently businesses are defying the mayor's executive order to allow employees to work from home. I doubt that this is the only city in the U.S. where we're seeing this, but this local news affiliate, News4Jax, had actually done an investigation documenting some of the businesses in which people are reporting that they're not having their rights as workers protected, or that their safety is not being protected. These are people working for Amazon, DT Security, UPS, Fortegra, a toy company called Jaru, Merrill Lynch, and Bank of America. At least half of those you probably recognize, those of you who are watching this. The employees are complaining that they're not being given cleaning supplies, or that people are not keeping a 6 feet distance from each other, which is recommended by the CDC. There was even one business supervisor from a company I didn't mention, Digital Risk, that apparently suggested that they recorded this supervisor suggesting that the compliance was optional in their mind. So there's that they're dealing with. And then there are the fact that there are staff members at places like one Amazon center is saying, shut this facility down. It needs to be cleaned top to bottom and then reopened. So you're having issues in some of these businesses where it hasn't been properly sanitized. So they fear coming into work on a daily basis. Some of these workers can't do their work from home. And that's a sad reality about what we're going through with some of us, like myself. I can do this work from home. And in fact, I always do the work that I'm doing from home. But some people, it's a requirement to be there to do the work. Like the people who are on the front lines at the grocery stores, they have to be there. They don't have an option to remove themselves from harm's way. And of course, that's true of the health professionals who are in the hospitals. Like they have to be there. But we're whistleblowers step forward who are letting being taken to protect their safety.
Thank you, Kevin. You mentioned Amazon in there, and they are the subject of the next story you have here. We've definitely heard a few things in the news, referring to paid sick leave and other horrendous conditions going on in Amazon warehouses. We know that they're hiring 100,000 more people right now, given the surge in delivery. What's going on with the conditions for Amazon workers?
Well, what's important to know is that they're doing very, very well in this environment. And they'll probably continue to do so, and they'll probably prosper greatly after this is all over. To the extent that we are now in a recession, I don't think that they're going to be hurt that much. They might even have more leverage to get away with these kinds of practices because there are going to be people who are out of work and need to depend on them for some kind of employment. So David Dayen, who is at the American Prospect, he's doing a very exceptional series called Unsanitized right now for the Prospect, where he's covering all of these important developments during this pandemic. And he looked at something, he had a report called The Dangerous Life of an Amazon Worker. And David talked to a worker about the hazard pay that's available. We're hearing about how workers have additional pay available in this time. But this worker, Tyler Hamilton at Shakopee, Minnesota, basically said that you can get this, but you need to work 40 hours plus overtime. So you're working extraordinarily long and an intense amount of hours, and then you're putting your safety at risk. And he broke it down here. I'm quoting from David here. The amount of people in warehouses and the workload makes physical distancing difficult. Amazon has put tape on the floor of Hamilton's warehouse using a standard of maintaining a 3-foot distance from coworkers, half of the recommended 6-foot standard. At least one Amazon worker tested positive for COVID-19 in a warehouse in Queens, that's in New York, and the company reopened the next day. Workers at 2 New York Whole Foods, a division of Amazon, have also tested positive. Then CNBC has also covered this and has talked to at least a dozen or so workers in the last few days who basically say they're terrified. They are, quote, forced to choose between going to work and risking their health or staying home and not being able to pay their bills. Workers are being given this option to stay home and out of the way they can stay and not take hours during this period, but then that means that they aren't getting any payment. And then I suppose if you're on the payroll, then you're not really technically unemployed. So how would you draw unemployment insurance? You're kind of in limbo. And so you have to choose to work in order to get some kind of income during this hard time. These workers are concerned about being shoulder to shoulder in some of these facilities or packing facilities. Several have been told that they should bring their own cleaning supplies, so they're not getting those supplies provided to them. And just for the record, according to CNBC, there are at least 10 facilities in the U.S. that have workers who have tested positive for the virus, and they all remain open. We just mentioned the Queens facility, but there's one that's been indefinitely closed in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, and that happened after there was a confirmed case of the coronavirus. So, that seems to be one of the few cases where Amazon has actually taken this seriously, but you have several facilities where the virus has popped up, and yet business keeps on trucking along.
Thank you for that, Kevin. Probably something that we will keep an eye on in the coming weeks. Our last story here is out of New York. We have a whistleblowing prisoner who said the New York prison labor in New York isn't actually making the hand sanitizer, a follow-up on a story that was making a lot of headlines about a week or two ago. What's happening here?
Yeah, so Vice talked to at least one of these prisoners that's involved in this labor, this prison labor. And just to be clear, we've seen Governor Andrew Cuomo, his popularity has skyrocketed during all of this, despite the fact that there are things happening in New York where prisoners are not being shown compassion and released from these facilities when they're vulnerable, like astoundingly on Rikers Island, which I know you're very familiar with, Brian. We've seen that there are still Medicaid cuts on the table in the state of New York, even during this crisis, which is just ghastly. But yet Andrew Cuomo continues to look like the crisis leader on CNN during the press conferences daily. The contrast has been drawn between him and Donald Trump. And one of the things he has said during his very early press conferences was that they were going to make this hand sanitizer to deal with shortages. And he said it would be superior to Purell, be even more higher in content when it came to alcohol. So it would be a more pure variety of sanitizer that it might be floral scented. Corecraft, this public facing brand of the New York State Department of Corrections, was going to be involved in putting this out. But as it turns out, according to Vice, there's not really any hand sanitizer being made. There's this massive act of deception being perpetrated here, where they're basically just taking it out of a bottle that's not marked, that apparently it's just being moved from some other manufactured content and then being put in these bottles that say NYS clean on them. And so this inmate who spoke anonymously said that the hand sanitizer initiative involves bottling sanitizer 24 hours a day, 3 8-hour shifts. There's actually one guy, he says, who worked for 116 hours in 1 week and just stays there. So people are offered overtime, and you can basically overwork yourself. The work means that you stand along an assembly line, you turn a nozzle, use a hose to squirt the sanitizer into the gallon-sized bottles. Other employees stand or sit along the line. They fill the bottles of various sizes, but that the focus largely remains on filling the gallon-sized containers. You're punished. If you were to take the hand sanitizer, you're going to face punishment because you're not allowed to touch the sanitizer. They do have latex gloves and protective glasses. The workers have been instructed to bottle 6,000 gallons of the sanitizer. So they're basically just taking hand sanitizer that already exists and they're moving it into other bottles that are just being packaged and then sold. That is what Vice is reporting here. And it sounds extraordinary given that we're allegedly dealing with a shortage, and maybe this is their way of dealing with price gouging, taking the market and coming into contact with the supply and bottling it so that another company doesn't sell it and gouge it. But we were led to believe that they were going to make the hand sanitizer, and they are not manufacturing hand sanitizer in this prison.
Thank you, Kevin. If I could just add, I think, part of the issue here as well is that, we have an economy in crisis. We have certainly a need for jobs. It's not to say that, people on the inside shouldn't have work to do necessarily, but we know that they're not getting paid anything, if only a little bit at all. They have no labor protections. As you said, they're working extremely long shifts. And I think part of it too is just, this is a case in a lot of states right now. Prison labor is often used by hospitals, for instance. In Oregon, you have prisoners cleaning the hospital laundry right now. And as far as we know, they're not getting any sort of additional guidance or protection. And I think that we need to both acknowledge the exploitation happening here and also give prisoners credit for their participation in trying to ameliorate the crisis. Because whether it is a pandemic like this, whether it's responding to wildfires, whether it is doing cleanup after a major hurricane and toxic conditions, we're seeing that states and other governments are offloading dangerous labor onto prisoners who, like I said, don't have workers' comp. They don't have any other kinds of protection. They often don't even get the gloves that you were mentioning. And then the other thing I just wanted to quickly mention with regards to the sanitizer in particular is that because hand sanitizer has alcohol content, it's considered contraband in most of these facilities. You can't, as a prisoner, actually possess a lot of cleaning supplies, whether it be rubbing alcohol or bleach, because it's considered contraband and you can get in trouble. And as you mentioned with Assange, we have prisoners at even higher risk than the general population of infection, given the conditions that they live in. And so the whole thing is just sort of this very absurd situation that I think is really symbolic of the plight that is facing prisoners right now. Again, they're on the front lines. They can't actually use any of this stuff. Their labor is exploited. They don't get any credit for helping out. So I just wanted to sort of put a bow on that. And I appreciate you including this story in the roundup this week.
Yeah, so I think we're about close to wrapping. I wanted to say a few words here that are future focused because there are a limit to, there's definitely, because everyone's doing coronavirus news, there's a lower amount of stories out there that typically might be available. There are certain stories related to whistleblowing that have stalled. There are cases that have stalled. Of course, week to week, we like to highlight these cases and remind you that there are people who are in jail. We don't have to, fortunately, update you on Chelsea Manning. She was released, and as we said last week, just for those of you who have followed this week to week, they did raise the money to cover living expenses, and also to cover that cruel fine that the judge insisted on still imposing even after Chelsea was released from jail. But then in prison, we already mentioned Assange. We're coming up, it's only a few weeks before we'll hit the 1-year date for the time that he's been in detention, awaiting extradition. And then we've got Reality Winner's case, the NSA whistleblower who's at a facility in Texas. Again, through this, like a lot of parents, a lot of family members, they've been terrified about what could happen at the FCI Carswell facility down in Texas and if it would spread. I haven't heard or seen anything related to Terry Albury, but he is a prisoner who's serving a sentence as an FBI whistleblower. But the risks still stand that he and anyone else who is related, family would be concerned about what might happen with the pandemic. But also looking forward, I wanted to just say very quickly here that we should think about where we might find whistleblowers in this moment. One thing you can do when you're reading coverage locally and in national news media is look for these people who are taking the risk to share their thoughts and to reveal what's happening in their workplaces or at government offices, government agencies, hospitals right now. People who are speaking anonymously to the press, they are a kind of whistleblower. They are talking as sources, but they also, you'll see noted possibly that they face retaliation, and that's why they don't want to have their name attached to their comments. These are people who are not abusing anonymity in the press. They're not political strategists. They're not people who work at intelligence agencies who should have to go on the record and have what they're saying attached to their name. They're people who are vulnerable, who are saying something because they're fearful and anxious about what they're seeing in their workplace or in the government agencies where they work. And they see the crisis of accountability. They see the crisis of conscience that's going on, the corruption, the moral rot that's at the core of our government on all levels. And I also want to end by saying that we just saw this stimulus bill pass. And while there were apparent gains made related to unemployment insurance that are going to be tremendously helpful to people who are vulnerable, and there's going to be the one-time cash payment, it's a small kind of a gesture for working people. It's terribly inadequate in the grand scheme. And what you're going to see is that there's somewhere around $4 to $5 trillion that's going to be transferred into the coffers of these mega corporations Small businesses are going to have loans available, but that pales in comparison to what is available to these corporations. And we're going to need whistleblowers to tell us about what's happening with this money at corporations. We're going to need to hear from people at Boeing about how this money was abused, because we haven't really taken care of what Boeing did when those airplanes crashed, because they knew that they had faulty equipment and they crashed, and they should be put on trial for the negligence and what essentially amounts to manslaughter, really, because they knew that they had the ability to know that those airplanes were faulty and should not have gone up in the air. You have airline companies that are going to be able to take advantage of this money. We need to know how they're using it and what might happen to undermine the power and influence of unions who are going to be protecting and asserting their rights as flight attendants, etc. And so that's one example. We know that there are other companies like Amazon and others that might be able to benefit from getting some of this money. And there's a lot more that we need to learn about who particularly is going to benefit. But the Treasury is going to be pumping this money into corporations to make it so that like the pandemic is barely even a blip. And in fact, they might come out even stronger after this. Meanwhile, there's going to be tons of working families and others who are struggling. It looks like we just crashed there, maybe. Did I drop?
Still here. No, you're still here. You're good.
I don't know if you heard me there, but it looked like at the end, as I was wrapping up my monologue, that we might have just dropped the connection. But anyway, if you all managed to get most of that thought, I thank you again for tuning into the show and watching. And the sound of my furnace kicking on tells me that we have reached the end of our broadcast, and it's time for us to say goodbye. So, anything you wanted to leave them with, Brian, and then we can wrap. Anything you want to tell them about Shadowproof?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for watching. I want to ask everybody to please keep safe and please stay isolated. And in particular, please keep an eye on what is happening in your local jails, in your prisons. You know, a lot of these stories that we've covered on here today and in general have to do with detention centers. That's a lot of the work we do at Shadowproof. And I just really encourage you to stay focused on what is happening in your backyard, because right now we're watching a slow motion tragedy with the pandemic as it pertains to law enforcement and what is going to happen to people who are trapped inside these centers. So with that, I would just ask you to keep in touch with us. You can contact us at editors@shadowproof.com, subscribe to the show on YouTube, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. And again, I know a lot of people are impacted pretty hard by this economically. But if you are in a position to contribute, please consider even just $5, $10 at shadowproof.com/donate. It helps us continue to do this show and get information out to everyone. So thank you again, and please stay safe.